From tearing out people's eyes to making fathers eat their dear sons, from being stretched on the rack to having your arms pulled from their sockets, here is how torture has evolved over the years. Buckle in, this is gonna be brutal. In the 1980s, a group of archaeologists came across something in the ground that excited them but also gave them a bit of a shock. What they saw pointed to something they'd long suspected. That was, some of the first people to switch from hunting and gathering to farming were indubitably sometimes very nasty to each other. These folks were into torture. For a very long time, various intellectuals had talked about the so-called noble savage. These early societies, they said, were mostly peaceful. They said people only got violent later on when they became corrupted by civilization, by early capitalism. These people didn't believe what the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes once said about the state of human nature. That was that people were always at war with each other. That the natural state of things was pretty damn ruthless. Hobbes was famous for saying life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This was not the kind of thing many people wanted to hear. They preferred the noble savage point of view, that humans are essentially nice and it's the systems they live in that make them cruel and warlike. But what the archaeologists found seemed to suggest that some people in those early days of civilization were not kind in the least. In fact, they were rotten to the core. These people had traveled from what is modern-day Turkey to Central Europe. We now call them Neolithic people, folks who started farming and appreciating modern things such as decorating their pots. They also liked a bit of extreme violence every now and again. We know that because archaeologists found mass graves in both Germany and Austria. The bodies numbered at around 100. But what was strange was that families hadn't been buried together, which was usually the way things happened back then. These folks had just been dumped, it seems, without any kind of ceremony. There had been a massacre. But it was the torture they'd gone through before they died that really shocked the scientists. Adults, male and female, and quite a few kids had their skulls bashed in. But before that final blow, it seems someone had broken their shins. We don't know why, but the archaeologists believe that whoever had killed them had wanted them to suffer as much as possible. We're talking about literally breaking people, whole families. Sure, there's a chance that this is not how things had gone down. Perhaps, said some of the scientists, the families had been smashed up after death. Maybe so, their ghosts couldn't go after their killers. But it remains certain that they had been killed in a very brutal fashion. This is about as far back as torture goes, at least what we know about anyway. After this time of shin breaking, torture really took off, and as you'll see today, it was often very extreme. If you're wondering what actually defines torture, we can look at what the United Nations says about it. It says that torture is any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him or a third person information or a confession, punishing him for an act he or a third person has committed or is suspected of having committed. That is pretty vague. You could say being forced to watch a Justin Bieber concert over and over and over and over again is a kind of torture. Ancient folks didn't have that kind of power at their fingertips though, so they had to make do with old school types of torture. We know that torture during interrogations was a thing in the Achaemenid Empire, sometimes called the First Persian Empire. This was founded by Cyrus the Great in 550 BC. From Persia, they spread out to the Balkans and Eastern Europe. They were an advanced civilization for the time, but they also had a taste for blood. Alexander the Great discovered this when he pretty much overran their entire empire. King Cyrus was admired by those ancient Greeks, and he was even known for his endorsement of human rights. But that didn't mean he was against torturing people. He would likely have embraced the saying, if you want to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. Or should we say, heads. One of the stories says about him that his wife was peeved one day with one of the palace eunuchs. These were the castrated guards in the palace. She told Cyrus that this man needed to be punished. In fact, she said he had to be killed 3 times. We don't know what got her so riled up, but we do know what happened to that poor eunuch. According to the tale, she ordered that he have his eyes pulled out. This happened, but he was then left for a while to get better. Once he was feeling better, although blind as a bat, she had his skin flayed. She then allowed him once more to be nursed back to some semblance of health. Only then did she allow him his third and final death, a death by crucifixion, which is torture in itself. This kind of torture actually had a name. It was called the triple death. It didn't always go the same way as what happened to the ill-starred eunuch, but the goal was always the same: make someone feel as much pain as was possible before they died. Then there was the story told by the great Greek philosopher and historian Plutarch. In his book, Life of Artaxerxes, he wrote that Cyrus the Younger had fought with his brother Artaxerxes II so he could become the one sitting on the throne. This kind of thing was not uncommon back then. There was a battle and Cyrus the Younger was killed. A young Persian soldier named Mithridates ran back to the palace and told everyone that he had dealt the killer blow. But it turned out he hadn't. He had just thought that he had. Cyrus's mom, Parysatis, heard about this Mithridates character, and let's just say she came down pretty hard on the guy. There are a few stories about what happened to him, but they all involve extreme torture. One story says he was first strung up on a wheel and left in the sun for 10 days. Then they pulled his eyes out, and the pièce de résistance was someone pouring molten gold into his ears. The other story says she ordered that he die by way of scaphism. This consisted of the victim being tied up between boats and then being force-fed milk and honey for quite a while. And in the end, the guy would be eaten inside out by all the bugs that went to feast on his poop and his vomit. This is why scaphism has made our top 10 list of worst ways to die. So when it comes to torture, the Persians were quite a remarkable bunch of people. So far we talked about their physical torture, but some of them were renowned for mental torture. One story involved King Astyages. This guy was the top dog in the Median Empire until his grandson Cyrus the Great took his throne. Before that happened, King Astyages was perhaps a bit paranoid. He had good reason to be that way though, so we'll not criticize him too much for that. One night he had a dream that his baby grandson would one day defeat him and take the throne. As you know, that actually happened. After he had the dream, he told a general named Harpagus to kill the infant child. Harpagus just couldn't do it, so he gave the kid to a shepherd and lied about killing him. It wasn't until a decade later that Astyages found out he'd been cheated by his usually trustworthy general. He was less than pleased, and he wanted to punish Harpagus in the worst way possible, so as anyone would do, he slit the throat of Harpagus' son. He then chopped him up and cooked his flesh on a spit roast at a banquet. Not known for his tolerance, Astyages then invited Harpagus to join the banquet and taste some of the delicious meat he'd gotten from the local butcher. As Harpagus was filling his stomach and enjoying a few glasses of wine, Astyages whispered in the ear of one of his servants and told him to bring out the head of the boy and place it on the table in front of Harpagus. You can only imagine the shock this caused, especially when Astyages said to Harpagus, "Do you know what beast's meat you have eaten?" Inside, Harpagus wanted to stick his knife down his boss's throat, but of course, if he showed even the slightest bit of anger, he'd soon be dead himself. He collected his thoughts and told the king, "I know, and all that the king does is pleasing." He said the dish was so good that he liked to take a doggy bag home with him. When he got home, he buried what was left of his son behind the house. So these Persian folks might have been good at building roads and inventing postal systems, but when it came to torture, they weren't very progressive. And at the end of the day, the underlings usually took the blame for everything. The leaders didn't have any scruples about fully embracing inequality. One time, King Artaxerxes II's mom killed his own wife. You'd think that he would have taken his anger out on his mom, but that kind of thing didn't usually happen. Instead, he had all of her servants executed. It was a slow and horrible death for each of them, consisting of someone slowly crushing their heads with large stones. Despite the threat of violence, people still broke the law from time to time. Often that would consist of laying in wait on a road and jumping out when someone with valuables was passing by. Understandably, the rich folks hated this, so they invented some very brutal punishments for thieves. One punishment consisted of finding two trees that were quite close together. Once they had the right trees, the soldiers would pull them toward each other with all their might. They then tied ropes to each tree and tied the hands of the prisoner to each rope. Once the prisoner was in place, they let the trees spring back to their natural positions, and the prisoner was torn in two, or at least his limbs would have been separated from his body. They'd be left like that so anyone thinking about stealing could see what would happen to them if they were caught. There were also more insane tortures. One time a Persian judge was flayed alive for accepting a bribe, and his skin was made into the fabric of a chair. His son was then made the judge, and he had to sit on that chair every day. This was mental torture. Other times, Persian bosses threw people into hot ashes. In one documented case, a queen was upset, and she ordered 12 noble women to be buried alive. No reason was given as to why she did this. According to the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, Amystris, the wife of King Xerxes the Great, ordered 14 children of noble women to be buried alive. But guess what the reason was? Herodotus said it was just because she wanted to show gratitude to her god for giving her a long life. It's hard to imagine what the parents of the kids thought about that. but you can be sure they didn't air their grievances. So torture wasn't always performed to get a confession from someone. It was also used to make an example of someone by administering a slow death, be it either a physical or mental one. It was all about someone flexing their muscle, letting people know who was in charge. Now let's move on from the Persians. The ancient Greeks did it too, but usually only against foreigners and slaves. In fact, in Athenian law, it was stated that if someone should confess, then it had to be a confession wrought through torture. The Greek legislators actually said that doing it this way was the most democratic. Yep, that is indeed insane. And those ancient Greeks weren't exactly stupid either. In one text, it states, "You jurors consider torture the most accurate of all proofs in both private and public cases. And when slaves and free persons are both available, and you need to discover some fact under investigation, you do not use the testimony of the free persons, but you subject the slaves to torture." The writer said that this is the best and most democratic way to do things, since some free people sometimes lie in court. He added, "No one subjected to torture has ever been proven to speak untruthfully." Well, we think that this guy was way off target with that remark. It's hard to imagine such a wonderful and groundbreaking civilization not understanding that torture might not be the best way to get someone to tell you the truth. People will generally say anything when facing extreme torture, which makes a confession highly unreliable. Just like the Persians, the free Greeks with all the power thought that they were better than slaves or foreigners. They would laugh you out of court if you could go back in time and tell them they were not superior to those people. The Romans were the same in this regard. Foreigners and outsiders were deemed much less civilized. They were called savages, so when Nero used to tie people to poles and cover them in a flammable substance so he could light them all up and have a big Roman candle show, he didn't think he was doing anything wrong. If you tortured someone else's slave for what you considered a transgression, you might have had to pay the owner of the slave some money if you accidentally killed or disabled him. The injured party got nothing, of course. The issue was between the free people only. The slaves had absolutely no power in such situations. In the year AD 61, a slave killed his Roman master. Guess what happened as a punishment? 400 slaves were killed. This was because the Romans wanted to make a statement. It was overkill, but slaves were really deemed inferior people. Whipping, branding, and beating slaves was not just legal but expected if the slave did not perform his duty. The Romans sometimes made slaves fight wild beasts in the arena, or sometimes tied them in a bag with a dog, a rooster, or a monkey and then threw that bag into a body of water. These were death sentences but were also supposed to be a kind of torture, as was crucifixion. In ancient China, they sawed people in half. They flayed their flesh, they sometimes just chopped off their feet or flayed their faces. These things too were supposed to be torture, not just a death penalty. Being executed fast was seen as merciful back then. And if the authorities or the ruler wanted to get some information from the condemned, then a slow, painful death could always prove to be useful, or so they thought. Such was the case with the Chinese Ling Chi, or slow slicing in English. The condemned person had a choice: give a full confession and receive a death blow, or don't talk and receive many painful cuts. The Chinese introduced this around the year 900, but they were still doing it in the 20th century. Let's now focus on something that was a renowned form of torture in parts of Europe during the Middle Ages. This one we are sure you all know: the rack. This was a torture machine which used rollers, ropes, and pulleys to basically stretch someone. When used during an interrogation, the person might have been stretched to the point of breaking, when their limbs were pulled from their joints. As you can imagine, it was a very painful way to go. The rack was actually around in ancient Greece and Rome, but we've already talked about those guys. So let's choose another destination. We'll pick Great Britain, where on every November 5th people celebrate by building bonfires and throwing an effigy on the fire. That effigy represents the body of a man named Guy Fawkes. It seems pretty sick that the Brits would stand around a raging fire, kids and adults eating toffee apples, pies, and mushy peas, having a jolly old time while celebrating the execution of a guy that had his stomach pulled out and his limbs removed. They even watched fireworks called Catherine wheels, based on the breaking wheel where people were bludgeoned to death. This might be why the Brits sometimes have quite the dark sense of humor. Kids in elementary schools even used to sing songs about dying of the plague. Ring a ring of roses, pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. That's pretty sick for a kid's song. Anyway, Guy Fawkes. He was part of a conspiracy to blow up Parliament, the place now known for its politicians' cocaine use and Brexit. But back when Fawkes was around in the 16th century, politicians weren't quite so dodgy. They did, however, not take it lightly when they discovered the plot to blow them to smithereens. They tortured Fox and told him to give them the names of his co-conspirators. At first, Fox was so tough that even King James remarked about his impressive resolution. The king then ordered that Fox be taken to the dreaded Tower of London, where legally he was to be tortured. The king said that they should go easy on him at the start, but if he didn't speak, then they should get bloody serious. Fox held out through the first day of torture, but on the second day it proved too much for him. Little by little he spilled the beans. We don't know for sure if the rack was used in this case, but most historians believe it was, because his handwriting for his confession looked as though it had been written by a man who'd been through the ringer. Things weren't about to get any better either. The men were given a pretty rough sentence. Firstly, they were to be hanged, but in a way where they could still live for a few minutes. Then their genitals were to be removed with a sharp knife and burned in front of them. Then came the removal of their bowels and hearts. Lastly, their heads would be removed and their bodies cut into quarters. So, this too was a kind of torture. It was supposed to be harrowing, not just for the victim but also for the people watching. These spectacles of utter brutality were supposed to send a message. The rack itself had been around in Britain since the 15th century. It was seen as a very useful device when it was used to get traitors, conspirators, or even heretics to give up other people or at least admit they'd done something wrong. It wasn't used in the extreme sense very often, and it's believed that the very sight of the thing would get people talking. Before they heard their limbs pop, they usually spilled every last bean. This wasn't the case with a brave woman named Anne Askew. She was a preacher and she supported Martin Luther. He's known for kicking off the Protestant Reformation. Cut a long story short, Askew did a lot of preaching. She went around talking to folks about Protestantism, and this got her arrested a bunch of times. In 1546, just a year before King Henry VIII's death, she ended up in the Tower of London. Her interrogators asked her who had also been preaching the word of Protestantism, but she refused to give them any names. Women weren't often tortured in those days, but she got the full Monty, the restraints, and the rack. We know what went down because she took some notes. She wrote, "Then Master Rich and one of the council charged me, upon my obedience, to show them unto if I knew any man or woman of my sect. My answer was that I knew none. They said they unto me that the king was informed that I could name, if I would, a great number of my sect. I answered that the king was as well deceived in that behalf, as dissembled within other matters." She was subsequently taken down to the dungeon. There, Sir Anthony Kingston told the jailer to put her on the rack. He believed that as soon as her body touched it, she would start talking. But that's not what happened, so he ordered the jailer to stretch her. The Lord Chancellor was also there. The jailer didn't want to do it. The sight of her grimacing and the quiet howls that issued from her lips was just too much for him. He was then reminded that if he didn't turn the wheel, the king would find out, and he'd probably end up facing a serious sentence himself. Just before they really started to stretch her, they asked her if she was with child. She replied, "Ye shall not need to spare for that, but do your wills upon me." Translated into modern language, that means, don't worry about that, get on with it. Do your worst. She later wrote, "They then put me on the rack, because I confess no ladies or gentlewomen to be of my opinion. And thereon they kept me a long time. And because I lay still and did not cry, my Lord Chancellor and Master Rich took pains to rack me with their own hands, till I was nigh dead." One guy who saw what happened next later wrote about it, saying, "Her bones were almost plucked asunder. Her screams could be heard in the next building, where a woman was sitting with her child. It was an awful thing to hear. They then asked her again who she was working with. She said nothing. She later wrote, "My Lord God gave me the grace to persevere and will do, I hope, to the very end." The king later found out about what had gone down and was apparently not too pleased that this woman had been tortured like that. She was so beat up after her stretching that she had to be carried away on a chair. Still, as you probably know, King Henry VIII wasn't exactly anti-execution. On the day when she was to be burned at the stake, she still couldn't walk and had to be taken to the scaffold on a chair. It was later written, when she was brought onto the stake, she was tied by the middle with a chain that held up her body. When all things were prepared, the king's letters of pardon were brought, whereby to offer her safeguard of her life if she would recant, which she would neither receive, neither yet vouchsafe once to look upon. As was often the case in these matters, the executioner tried to make death fast by putting gunpowder around her neck. He then lit the fire, and soon there was an unholy conflagration about her body. Witnesses remarked that she didn't scream until the flames started searing the flesh from her chest. You might now be wondering, did anyone actually die on the rack in Britain? The answer is yes. It happened to one guy named Nicholas Owen. Testament to how unhinged and insane humanity can be at times, He wasn't put on the rack because of his devotion to Protestantism, but because he was a devout Catholic. He was actually a really good stonemason and carpenter, and he used his skills to make hiding places for priests. These were called priest holes. We're sure you might have seen one in a movie or on TV, when a person of a various religion was to hide in a box or a little secret room for whenever the king's men came looking. As someone who was good at making these secret rooms, Owen became a wanted man, especially when rumors got around that he helped a guy escape from prison. Owens was eventually caught and charged with the crime of building those priest holes. At the time, Secretary of State Robert Cecil said, "It is incredible how great was the joy caused by his arrest, knowing the great skill of Owen in constructing hiding places and the innumerable quantity of dark holes which he had schemed for hiding priests all through England." They thought Owen had been hiding folks for years, so with a little help from the rack, they believed they could get him to tell them where all the priests were. They took him to the Tower of London and introduced him to a rack that had been created by a famous priest hunter named Richard Topcliffe. Thing was, Owen was in really bad shape. He was partially disabled after falling from a horse, and he also had a great big hernia, so no sooner than the rackmaster started turning the wheel, Owen's intestines looked as though they were about to explode out of his stomach. Not one to show much sympathy, the rackmaster just grabbed a heavy chunk of iron plating and put that on Owen's stomach. When he was stretched a little more, the hernia bulged out and was sliced by the plate, which didn't end things very well. Owen was soon dead. He was later made into a martyr because if he had squealed about the location of his priests, scores of people would likely have been executed. Around that same time, there was another kind of device that worked in a similar way. This was the strappado. This machine had been called a kind of reverse hanging. That's because men had their hands tied behind their back and then they were pulled up by a rope attached to their wrists. The pain must have been excruciating, especially because the torture almost always dislocated the shoulder joints. It's said that a person could have lifelong injuries from being pulled up like that. So this was just as bad as the rack, if not worse. As you probably know though, being pulled up by your hands when they're tied behind your back doesn't always have to involve a large device. Sometimes people were just hung up by hooks. The Nazis sometimes did this at their concentration camps. During the Vietnam War, some American soldiers were treated to this punishment while they were spending time in a North Vietnamese prison. Something similar might have happened to Senator John McCain when he was captured and tortured during the war. Decades later, CIA operatives did almost the exact same thing when they were torturing suspected terrorists at Abu Ghraib prison. In fact, one prisoner there, named Manadel al-Jamadi, died after being strung up by his wrists. This brings us to the most modern forms of torture, which are not supposed to leave any visible injuries. The psychological aspect now plays a leading role over the physical aspect. Maybe this is progress, but using progress and torture in the same sentence doesn't quite feel right. Now you need to hear about one of the worst kinds of modern torture in White Room torture, worst punishments in the history of mankind. Or let yourself be disturbed with Inside the CIA's Terrifying Sleep Room.